Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm so very glad that each of you is here. Welcome to All Saints Rectors Forum for those of you who are streaming. And we've had about 100 people streaming Sunday to Sunday. We're rather kind of amazed at it. It's wonderful. Welcome. Glad you're with us. For those of you who are not already on the mailing list, of All Saints Church and would like to receive an email note from me every Thursday describing what's coming up, we have green sign-up sheets at both exits, and we'd love to have your contact information. For those of you who would like to make sure that All Saints Church has a mission that is perpetuated, we would love to have your financial involvement, and there are pledge cards all over the campus. Just ask somebody for one, and they'll happily get you one. And also, we have an action table here at All Saints Church. We like to say that our worship is not complete until we've taken action on the good news. And so we're today looking at reform of our elections and particularly reversing the Citizens United and similar renderings from the courts. Tonight we will be back at 5 for more conversation with our speaker. And then tomorrow night we will be here for our second installment of this wonderful series having to do with finding a new story, a new narrative, with John Philip Newell, who will be talking about a new understanding of God in all of this. We have books for sale by our illustrious guest today. His book launch is here at All Saints Church today and tonight. Change the Story, Change the Future, which is exactly what we're talking about. And an earlier wonderful piece of his also, which is entitled The Great Turning. So you can purchase both of these books over at the table to my left. Let me just say a quick word about David. He is an economist by training and work, preeminent business, academic, and international development institutions. He worked there before he turned away from that establishment and the establishment to work exclusively with public interest citizen action groups. He is the co-founder and board chair of Yes magazine, and we have copies of that, right? Yes. We do? Okay, and wonderful. These are just amazingly progressive, cutting-edge, audacious, instructive and illuminating magazines. How about that? Is that okay with you? And I highly recommend them. He's the co-chair of the New Economy Working Group, the founder and president of the Living Economies Forum, formerly the People-Centered Development Forum, a member of the Club of Rome, a former member of Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and associate of International Forum on Globalization. His graduate degrees, MBA and PhD, are from Stanford University Graduate School of Business. He has done a great deal of work teaching at Harvard and in other absolutely amazing institutions. He has a long and impressive bio, but with his forgiveness, I want to simply move into our conversation as soon as you join me in warmly welcoming David Korten. Welcome. David is no stranger to All Saints Church, and David really has been one of our pioneers throughout the world in helping us with this project of creating a new story. And I was delighted yesterday to learn that there is a new Skype DVD series that you and I can subscribe to for free, where 55 leading thinkers of the globe are interviewed one by one to talk about this business of sustainability and how we're going to have to live, and how we're going to have to change our story. And David is one of those thinkers. So Entheos is the way to kind of Google that and get to it, Entheos. And I think that you'll really benefit a great deal. We are actually joining a conversation that's been in the works for a while, and David will tell us about that in a few minutes. Anyway, I'm so very, very glad you're here and that you are engaging this. Please be back at 5 tonight. We're going to go even deeper, more deeply than we can in these 45 minutes. So, David, if you don't, and David and I are going to have this conversation, and then David will make actually a little more formal presentation tonight about his book. And we want you to get involved in the conversation this morning too. But David, if you don't mind, if we could just start with Marcus Borg. He died this past week, and I know that he was very important in your journey that has brought you to what you're able to share with us today. Could you just tell that story or any other story you want to tell?
Well, I think I'll take one step back before that to Thomas Berry. Actually, my first connection with this church came through Marty Coleman and When Corporations Rule the World, which originally came out in 1995. And as I was writing that book, I happened to come across Thomas Berry's Dream of the Earth. And I know many people here have read it, and you know his basic message, that when we as a people outlive our story, our framing story no longer works, we can be in deep trouble. And the times of transition between stories are times of human turmoil. That struck very deeply with me, and I began the exploration then. And of course, there was a trajectory from 1995 when a number of us were coming out with this message about corporate rule and the implications of trade agreements, what's going on with these CEO compensation packages, outsourcing of jobs, and so forth. That led up to a kind of bursting forth of resistance and energy around the Seattle WTO protests in 1999. Now, in the preparation for that protest, the Seattle and Washington State Councils of Churches sponsored a conference to inform members of the faith community what the issues were, what that protest was going to be about. And I had no knowledge of Marcus at that time, but we were both speakers on that forum. And Marcus's message just struck so deeply in my soul. It's been a framing piece ever since. His message: tell me your image of God, and I will tell you your politics. Now, I don't know, maybe you've all heard or read Marcus speaking on this. Even if not, perhaps you can infer what his message is. Essentially, he noted that within the Christian Bible, there are actually two very different images of God portrayed. One is the image of the distant patriarch, in a sense, the ruler, the all-knowing, the all-powerful, all by his will God. And that sets up a natural sense of hierarchy, social hierarchy. Who is the closest to God? Who is the most favored? And of course, you get into the Calvinist tradition where it became fairly explicit. Well, you know God's most favored. Obviously, they are the rich and powerful. The other image of God is the spirit image. The pervasive, all-encompassing, ever-present, unifying spirit from which all is manifest. We are all expressions of that spirit. All being is expression of that spirit. That is the frame for deep democracy, for cooperation, for creative participation in the ongoing process of creation. And I was thinking of it this morning as you were talking about our images, our narratives. And we've been kind of conditioned to think of Genesis as, in a sense, the beginning and the end. I mean, God created the world, and then, of course, the science story that emerges then went away and left the clock to run down. By that spirit story, if we combine that with what science actually tells us about the unfolding of creation, which is actually parallels very much the Genesis story of creation. It's a continued unfolding. Creation is not over, it is ongoing. It is the Spirit manifesting through this creative process, unfolding toward ever greater complexity, beauty, awareness, and possibility. And you begin to get into that we are all part of that, and it is ongoing, and then we begin to say, wow, that's a whole new way to think about our vocations at various stages in our lives. It is a story that gives our existence deep meaning, and it's not about getting on the right side of the big guy to get a good place in the afterlife. It is about being creative contributors to the ongoing process of creation. Wow. That's kind of cool. And, you know, as you were talking about, you know, getting to where you're now finding your vocation, I'm 77. I'm a few years older than our Reverend. And it's good to see the young people coming along and finding finding their purpose in life. And I know there are several of you of our generations here. And, you know, kind of personal story. You know, this is a wonderful age. You know, many of us by this time, we have got a little experience. We've made some connections with influential people like Ed and Marty here and others in this group. And it's, we have nothing to lose in a way. So it's a good time for audacious goals. We have the freedom, we have the experience, we have the privilege. And so my goal at this point is to change the framing stories of the species and change our course. Hey, what? And the reason I'm delighted to be here is because I know many of you have exactly the same vocation, the same mission, and so we're working together.
Thank you. Wonderful. So changing the framing stories of the universe. Now, I think that there are several levels that we all have to kind of grapple with when we're talking about this. And one of the places that has been a passionate meeting place for David's thinking and my thinking is that I ran into some work having to do with the Middle East peace process or lack thereof. And at the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Leadership School, there was some work done about framing narratives being either toxic or generative. And that toxic narratives do that. They inject toxin into our relationships, into our systems, and into our future. Generative framing narratives, on the other hand, are those which allow us to sustain the generations. And so, applying it to that particular problem, there were some really important conversations. And I have found that distinction between toxic and generative narratives to be able to be applicable to every issue. And the whole point underneath that categorization was that there is this reality of having inherited narratives. And that for thinking people, our job is to be aware of the narratives we've inherited, which are framing or driving our lives, and to change them to the degree that they are toxic. So David has really taken the spirit of that and has really updated it and brought a lot of audacity to it. So I just wanted to introduce those concepts into the conversation as a way of underscoring the fact that this is going to call for personal transformation as well as political transformation. So David, could you say any other words on your personal level of how you've moved on this journey before we get into the actual meat and content of the new framing narrative? So if you could talk personally a little bit, please.
I first want to check one of the things I thought I heard you say that this came from the Harvard Business School.
Either the Harvard Business School or the Harvard Leadership School, but it came out of one of those.
Those may be quite different.
I know. I understand. Granted.
It was the Harvard Business School where I taught at Harvard, and in a sense correcting Ed, who initially called me an economist, which I really, although most of us think of, the economists most of us think of are what I call phantom wealth economists. I'm beginning to get used to the idea that maybe I'm a real wealth economist. And this is the distinction between whether you're an economist that's focused on money or an economist that is focused on real wealth, the living planet. But also specifically, when I was teaching organization at the Harvard Business School in our field, we were often concerned with how do you organize workplaces so that people feel really engaged, feel that the work is meaningful and they have great relationships with one another and so forth. And we keep getting the message, well, that's okay if you can prove that that improves the financial bottom line. Now, that of course is part of a real toxic story, which we'll get a little further into. But the other part of my journey that is so crucial here is that Fran and I, my wife here, who's the publisher of Yes Magazine, we've been married for 52 years, or we're going on 53. I highly recommend a long marriage. We're kind of getting together. You learn how to live together after the first 50 or so years. Anyhow, we spent much of our careers and our lives actually working overseas on the mission to end global poverty. So we worked in international development. We were in a sense among the first generation in this transition from where we tended to grow up in our own communities. We lived within our own culture. We had very little exposure to other cultures. That has changed dramatically. Our lives were very much a part of that in terms of, I grew up in a little town called Longview, Washington, totally white. Mostly Protestant. The most exotic person in my life was my aunt, who was Catholic and had red hair. That was quite, wow, was she interesting. I loved her dearly. She had a wonderful talking parakeet. Anyhow, I had no idea that I would spend my life living all over the world. Fran and I lived and worked in Africa and Ethiopia, in Central America, throughout Latin America, and then in Asia, living in Philippines, Indonesia, working throughout Asia. Now, several things come out of this. One, being exposed to all these different cultures and deeply immersed in them, you begin to realize that different cultures have different stories, different ways of explaining reality, of framing their values, and that these have deep implications. They're fundamental to how we see ourselves, see our place in creation, and they lead to very different ways of organizing and relating. So that's one lesson. The other lesson was that, in our mission to end poverty and coming out of business school background and so forth, my view was that to end poverty, what we needed to do is take the lessons of U.S. business success to the rest of the world so they could become happy consumers like the rest of us. And I went into this from a deeply conservative background. Back at that time, we were very concerned, many of us, about the communist revolutions that were threatening our American way of life. So obviously the way to solve this problem was to make them more like us, and they'll be rich and they'll be happy, and all the revolution stuff will go away. Now, I've realized in hindsight that I'm kind of a slow learner. It took more or less 30 years to figure out that what we were teaching around the world, the message of American capitalism and corporate rule, which is what it's really about, was actually destroying people's lives. It was creating a few very rich people, it was creating a small middle class, but it was mostly pushing the majority of people into deep desperation. And it was destroying the environment, it was destroying once deep, rich cultures of community and connection to nature, and leading us toward a fundamental social, environmental, and governance collapse. Wow. That was a little disturbing. Now again, my field in business school was organizations. So my concern is, how do we organize? Now that was about how we organize corporations, but I flipped out of that into how do we organize as a global society? How do we structure our institutions? And then began to realize how fundamentally destructive that system is that we have created and by which we live. And one of the truly useful lessons of my business school education is our professors always said, if something's not working right in the organization, don't just focus on solving that problem. That's a symptom. If something's going wrong, it means there's something wrong with the system. There's the structures of the organization, the culture, the reward systems, and so forth, the way we communicate. So look upstream, solve that system problem, and that's exactly what I got into in terms of flipping out of the corporate frame into the frame of society, and how is it that our culture and our institutions shape our behavior. That led to things like When Corporations Rule the World. Then later on, The Great Turning, which incidentally we also launched at this church. I mean, this history, we are connected at the hip. But I ultimately came to realize that most foundational of all is the story.
Let's go back to the real wealth, phantom wealth issue. That's a huge part of that story. Just one connection with that in terms of my own personal journey. So I grew up a Southerner in a very small rural town, and the water we swam in, and I still think the water that we swim in as Americans, was in great part racist. And when I began to learn about the abolition of slavery, I read that the great economists of the world who were expressing sacred orthodoxy were saying that if we got rid of slavery, that the entire economic system would collapse. And that is how ethical decisions were made, was whether or not the quote-unquote economic system would collapse, which was the example that came to my mind when you were talking earlier about phantom and real wealth. Can we just go back to that a little bit, and you spell out some maybe more current examples that we are facing right now, where values are being determined by whether or not, by what you call phantom wealth economy?
Well, it's interesting, just as you started talking, I'm aware that in the church here, you're talking about a living wage campaign.
Exactly.
And economists are saying exactly the same thing. Right. Oh, a living wage will destroy the economy. Right. Fear and trembling. You know, Well, there's so many levels to this story. I mean, you mentioned the race issue. One of the things, well, the story of this book, The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community, traces back our 5,000 years of human history, of organizing by dominator hierarchy. Now, if you think about that basic frame of organizing with a few people on top, everybody else is inevitably on the bottom. Okay, well, think about how if you were going to design a society like that. That means you're going to get a competition for those few positions at the top. Well, if you're the folks in charge, it's very handy if you can create a story that says, well, people that are clearly identifiable because they got a different color skin, or they maybe are women, or some other identifying quality, and you define those as non-human. So they're not part of the competition. They're just out of the picture. So then it's just among us white males to fight it out. Well, it's kind of a crude version of the story, but it's a very big picture that we're still working to move beyond. And it is one reason why the dominator hierarchy or the oligarchy, those who are wedded to it, tend to favor the patriarchal God and the hierarchy of power. Because if we truly embraced the story of universal integral spirit manifesting, emerging, then we're all equal. That's a deep democracy story. And it's not just humans, it is all of creation. You know, it's interesting, there were various places in the service this morning where we talked about human stewardship of Earth. Well, stewardship of Earth is clearly preferable to the pillaging and exploitation of our Earth Mother. But if we really get down to the deeper story, Earth does not belong to us. We belong to Earth. We are not a part from nature, we are a part of nature. So that is an even deeper level, and that is where we begin to discover our being as real living beings, part of a living community. Now, to come back to the economists and the real wealth versus phantom wealth, I'd only become aware of this story fairly recently. The foundations of contemporary economic theory, which Nobel laureate economist Joe Stiglitz actually appropriately named a religion. Now, the Pope refers to it as idolatry, the worship of a false idol, or the worship of money. So what we are taught as economics is grounded in settled science is actually a religion of idolatry. That's a part of waking up. Now, where did this come from? Well, back in the 1800s, there were a group of economists who were very jealous of physics, called a bad case of physics envy. And they wanted to bring real stature to economics, to make it a science. So one of them looked around and he said, well, the physicists are talking about this mathematical model, but they think may describe energy in a closed system, et cetera, et cetera. Let's take that and we'll make that our model. And so they took it and they substituted some economic variables for the physical variables, as many people have pointed out, that made absolutely no sense whatever, either theoretically or empirically. And then once they were going to build around a mathematical model, they need to be able to quantify the variables. So the easiest thing to quantify in terms of economy is money. So they built a whole model around money, a whole economics around money. Now, this is another one of these critical moments in my experience. It was really the starting point for this book, Change the Story, Change the Future. Back in 2002, in the lead up to Rio Plus 20, the follow-up Earth Summit, I happened to be invited to a gathering at Pocantico, which is the old Rockefeller estate. It's now kind of a retreat center, but this was a gathering, a gathering of international indigenous environmental leaders. And they were there framing their message going into Rio Plus 20. And it was a very sharp group. They had become aware that the Wall Street folks were saying, yes, we must protect nature. To protect nature, we must value her. To value her, we must put a price on her. Oh. And the indigenous leaders, oh yeah, I think we've been there before. Price, commodify, monetize, privatize, securitize. This is the basis for the new mortgage derivatives bubble. And this is what really struck me, because it's very easy to get drawn into, we got to put a price on nature. But you think about it, you put a price on nature, that means only the rich people can afford. But it also means that nature is for sale. And these indigenous leaders were saying, Earth is our mother, the source of our birth and nurture. Our mother is sacred. Our mother is not for sale. And I pondered that. Wow. If we are born of earth, our very existence, our health and well-being, depend absolutely on the health of living earth and living earth's systems. If we were an intelligent species, we would realize that we cannot compromise those living systems. That whatever we do, those must be maintained. That is the foundation of life, and therefore it is the foundation of all wealth. Now, there was one other moment in that meeting that I found just totally life-changing. It was just 3 words. One of the participants was Karma Satim from Bhutan. He's the head of the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Commission. He gave us a little talk on, their frame, and at the end of his presentation he said, "Time is life." Now think about that. I don't know what your daddy taught you, but my daddy taught me. What is time? Money. Time is money. One of the courses I took in my senior year at Stanford was how to calculate the time value of money. Most everything in the business school education is organized around the time value of money. But what if life is not about making money, but life is about living? And what is living? What does that mean if we are living fully and well? Relationships, community, all the things that are the source of our real happiness. And what is money? Well, by the sacred money and market story that we have organized around, and we got sucked into this specifically because our deeper cosmologies are, that we've been taught no longer make sense. We organize around a story that time is money. Money is wealth. Making money creates wealth. Those who are making money are the wealth creators, the job creators. We humans, it is our nature to be individualistic, to be selfish, to be greedy, to be competitive, to strive to be on the top, to make more money than our neighbor. And that's all to the good, because the magic hand of the market turns that into maximizing the wealth and the well-being and benefit for all. Corporations are wonderful drivers of this, and of course, they're just people. They're just people. So they should have the same rights as any person, and they should be free. Free markets. You ever think about that term, free market? You know, we used to talk about market, but now it's always the free market. What that really means is free of any rules that might inconvenience or impair a corporation's ability to pillage the earth. Oh. And what is money truly? Nothing but a number on a computer hard drive. Now somebody said power. It is power by the way we organize, but intrinsically it is nothing but a number on computer hard drive. It is a system of accounting. And we've come around to make the accounting system the purpose rather than the measure. And of course the real wealth, the real measure of wealth is what is the health of our people, of our children, of our communities, of nature, of the living system. And if we really calculate that, we would not measure economic performance based on GDP or based on today's stock market price. We would base it on the health and well-being of all people, of all life, for all time. Totally different story. And this is why I am so delighted to be here and doing this launch with this church, because you are engaged in exactly this kind of inquiry.
So thanks for that really, really rich stuff. And I am very accustomed to being in the dilemma I am in right now of seeing that we have 6 minutes left and whether to persist with the line of questioning I have or opening up. I do want, I hope all of you will come back tonight. This really is about a conversation. And I want you to be here tonight and tomorrow night. And we're staying here for 5 more minutes. The choir has to leave. But the rest of us are going to stay for 5 more. Just tempt us. Give us an hors d'oeuvre or two about tonight in terms of, and you've already been suggesting this all along today, this morning, but the kind of the elements of the new story. Let's go there for just a second, please.
The basic elements of the new story, it starts with the cosmology. You know, they're kind of, in our culture, there are 3 kind of basic cosmologies. One is the distant patriarch, the traditional story of the Abrahamic religions. There is the grand machine story of Newtonian science, of it's all just a big clockworks winding down, which, you know, that's so depressing. I think I'll go shopping. And then there's a third story that is a pure integral spirit that says our ego is well, that all of what we experience in material reality is an illusion created of the ego, and it is the source of our suffering and conflict, and we must get rid of the ego and meld back into the oneness. That's a very beautiful story, but it's also basically an escapist story. It does not give us a guidance in terms of how we move ahead in the process of creation. Now, the foundation of the new story, which some of us call the living universe story, at least the way I frame it, is that it all started with the spirit, with a burning desire to know itself through a process of becoming, through a creative process of unfolding, manifesting, exploring its possibilities. That every being is a manifestation of that. And as I noted earlier, evolving ever forward toward ever greater complexity, beauty, awareness, and possibility. And science has a huge amount to contribute to that story. Each of these foundational stories actually has its contribution if we see each of them as partial and incomplete in itself. but bring it all together. Then if we see ourselves as unfolding beings, then we say, wow, Earth is the foundation of it all, from our immediate experience. And our life exists only in community, and basically cooperative community, if you truly understand it. And therefore, we need to learn to organize as life organizes, which means organizing as a community in a way that meets the needs of all and that sustains the conditions of life. One of the key things about the early evolution of life is the single-celled organisms that were the first life forms, actually working with the geological processes of Earth, transformed the surface of Earth to create the conditions essential to other forms of life to evolve, including humans. And that included taking excess carbons and toxins out of the environment and sequestering them deep under Earth. Okay, so now our economy is geared to taking those toxins and carbons out from deep under Earth in order to control and suppress the nature that supports us in order to increase the numbers on this computer hard drive. So we got a little work to do on our story. And the churches are a place to do it, and this is the starting point right here in All Saints Church.
Thank you, David Korten. Thank you very much. I learned in my radio work to set up teasers. So if you come back tonight at 5, you will get the full meal deal on the new story, not only for your own heart, mind, soul, body, thinking, and history, but also to equip you for how to have a conversation about this at the Thanksgiving table next year with Uncle Earl, who only watches one particular network, who will go without naming. David has already been to church. He's already had his Eucharist, so he'll be here to sign some books for a while. And we'll see you back at 5 o'clock. Thank you very much, David Korten.